Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we have a great video because it's going to be the first video I've done in a while. Holidays were a little stressful for me, and I was trying to move the channel in a direction. Well, I'm still moving the channel in a direction of more variety tabletop, but with the sudden increase in interest in Pathfinder 2e, I felt it was time for another build to come out, and plus, doing some research, it seems that the Magus builds is something that everyone is kind of looking up for right now. So, hey, I figured I'd toss a build out to appease those people who are looking for such a build. And we got a really good build today. The build is the temporal adept, or the time adept, however you want to go about it. It is a Magus build that is designed around the concept of being a little squishy, being a little softer than other Magus might be, but you jump in, do some damage, and jump out with your unique time abilities. I think I developed a very interesting and unique style of play for the Magus that has you very constantly watching the battlefield. It's very intuitive to how the game is played strategy-wise, and you're always on the lookout for what's going on because you're playing with a little bit of a less armored Magus than normal, but that's okay because you have lots of abilities to help get you out of trouble. And another big thing, today is going to be the day that we have our first ever sponsor on the channel. So I'm going to go ahead and give this to future me, as I won't be receiving the product until like a day or two after this when I'll review it. So future me, go ahead and take it. All right, everyone, for the first ever sponsor video here on the channel, I get the pleasure to show you guys the Hollow Book Dice Tower. These wonderful dice towers are made by Fire and Ash, who make all kinds of fun wooden design TTRPG accessories. And these are definitely the top of the line for them. They come in 3 different varieties. They get the GM, the Dragon, and the Cthulhu. And speaking of, this is the one they sent for me. This is the highest tier on the Kickstarter, the nice finished one. The Cthulhu box is really, really good. You can see here on the inside that they got all kinds of nice designs. You got a place to put your name as well. The dice tower pops up just like this, and you can see all these kind of designs here in the base. And look at this. This banding here on the back is all made from wood, nothing else. It's such a good design, gives it such a good feel, and it came with an additional box. The card box here, or dice box, whatever you want to use it for. The Cthulhu one is probably my favorite as far as the card boxes are concerned. You can pull up this tab here to reveal everything inside, and it's got that same wooden banded style, which I absolutely love. And so let me give you guys the details on the Kickstarter itself. So the Kickstarter actually started 2 days ago, and I couldn't do this any sooner because I just got the box yesterday from the day of recording this, and this is going to be coming out the day after I'm done recording this. So this is the earliest I could do it after getting the product in hand. And I gotta say, the quality is really good. But anyway, the importance is you don't got a lot of time. They're only allowing 100 backers as they're using the Make 100 program with Kickstarter. And at the time of this recording, they got about 13, 15 or so backers already. So for less than 90 people get access to this wonderful dice tower. And they start off at just 75 bucks, and there's 3 tiers. You get the unfinished with the dice box, and the final tier, which is the gold finished with the dice box as well. This is only lasting for 30 days, so if you want it, I recommend hopping onto it immediately. These are absolutely wonderful. They look good on your shelf or anywhere in your gaming area, or you can take these to your local gaming store and show them off and have probably the coolest dice tower box anywhere. Not only that, but you can't even find these kind of dice tower boxes in most locations. Even on Etsy, they're somewhat difficult to find, unless of course you're going to Fire and Ash. So if you want one of these premier style dice towers to show off to all your friends, or just to make a wonderful gift for an upcoming birthday, or even for Christmas, all the way around the calendar here, I recommend going to the Kickstarter as soon as possible. I'm linking it down below in the description. And remember, it's only for the next 90 or so backers, and it's only for the next less than a month now, like 27 days from the time of this video. So thank you so much, Fire and Ash, for sponsoring this video, and thank you so much for giving to me this book here. I absolutely love it, and we'll be getting back to the video. All right, so now let's get back to the build. So the Time Adept is a build that's very much focused on your dex, strength, and intelligence. So if you're keeping track up here in the corner here, there we go. Our stat focuses are going to be first dex. Dex is going to be very important because you're not going to be wearing armor in this build. So the higher your dex, the higher your AC is going to be, which is going to be very important, at least for the trash mobs that are attacking you in a scene. And not only that, but we're going to be having a higher focus on finesse weapons. So you want the ability to hit to be as high as possible. Following up, we're going to be using strength, because strength is going to be what adds to our damage, and we want to do as much damage as we possibly can in this build. And there are a variety of situations where the added strength is going to be very helpful for this build. And last but not least is going to be intelligence. Intelligence is going to be something that you're going to want to boost based on your needs for the class. Now, this build is not very specific for the play style of Magus you have. Rather, it's a good framework for your style of Magus with, some things that you can change as you will. But your intelligence is used if you need higher spell attacks or higher spell DCs. Spell DCs are going to be the biggest one. If you're using a lot of spells and abilities that are causing the enemy to make spell saves against your spell DCs, you're going to want your intelligence to be as high as possible. But if you're using your spells more for buffing yourself and more for, spells that don't really have straight save based effects, your intelligence doesn't need to be as high. And there's not even a really big skill need in this class as well. So take as much intelligence as you see fit. Honestly, if you're not using a lot of intelligence, something like charisma can work as well. But I do highly recommend investing in some intelligence at the very least, because you never know when you want to throw in some really interesting spells into your build that need spell saves. All right, as far as skills are concerned, it can more or less be what you want it to be, but I did pick 3 that I feel would be very helpful for this build. First and foremost is going to be Acrobatics, and we'll get to that in the build, but Acrobatics is going to be surprisingly useful, and since we're going to have such a high dex anyway, it's just a really good skill line to follow up. Next is going to be Stealth, and this is going to be a lot more important, honestly. I really do like Stealth in this build. Acrobatics needs to get Master by level 8. So after that, you can really go as much stealth as you want. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities for you to use stealth in this build, especially considering you're playing a squishier character. So being able to elude enemies, even in the middle of the battlefield, with some of the spells you're going to be picking up is going to be very handy. And last but not least is Athletics. Your strength is going to be pretty decent in this build, honestly. So picking up Athletics is good for a variety of reasons, whether it's tripping enemies or whether it's climbing buildings. This is going to be very dynamic, I feel, in the style of build that we're going for. So Athletics is a really good tertiary pick if, you've already maxed out your other 2 skills. And obviously, you can pick whatever skills in this build you want, and the higher your intelligence is, the more starting skill proficiencies you're going to have anyway. So there's a lot of room for wiggle room. Acrobatics I picked specifically for 1 feat, honestly, so it's not very important, and I'll get into a little later how you can circumvent it. Stealth, I think, is a lot more necessary, and Athletics was just kind of made sense because we're not going to really need things like Deception or stuff for fainting because we're going to be making the enemy flat-footed in other ways. But let's go ahead and get to what you are going to be picking as you level up. So first and foremost, when you're picking your Magus, we're going to go with the Laughing Shadow Hybrid Study for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, the Arcane Cascade is actually really good because once you get into the stance, you're going to get a status bonus to your speed of +5 and +10 if you're not wearing armor. Since this whole build is based on skirmishing, being in and out of combat, this is a really good way to enhance your speed and to force enemies to expend more of their actions to catch up to you if you back away from a combat situation. So being unarmored and getting that +10 status bonus to your speed is going to be really huge in this build. And on top of all this, we're going to be getting an extra benefit to our damage. For if we have a hand free and we're using a single-handed weapon, or even unarmed strikes, honestly, depending on how you want to go with the build, you get a bonus to your damage of 3 rather than the standard 2. It goes up to 5 when you get weapon specialization, and it goes up to 7 when you get greater weapon specialization. This is going to be really good because it's going to allow us to get some really good benefits from some special kind of weapons I'll get to in a little bit. And overall, what I'm aiming for with this build is to make your singular hits hit incredibly hard. So this is a really good style of Magus that you can go, and one that I'd highly recommend, though I'm going to say as well, this is not the only way to go about doing this build. This is just the one that I felt was the most fun for a unique playstyle. And I didn't even mention this before, but if you want to make this build even more tense and a little bit more fun, in my opinion, don't invest in your con whatsoever. Just baseline your con. I want to go with a negative con, but I would like a 10 in your con. Magus gets a decent amount of health just from being Magus and being kind of that mid-martial range of HP. But if you don't invest in your con, they'll extra motivate you to stay away from your enemies, which I think will make for a very interesting and diverse play style. And the Laughing Shadow is really good at keeping away from your enemies. A little bit later, Dimensional Assault does require you to teleport next to an enemy, but there are some situations where even that's not going to be too bad, but we'll get into that in the build. Some other things about the Laughing Shadow that I feel I should mention as well is your studious spells that you get at 7th and 11th level. Mirror Image and Shift Blame are also really good at damage mitigation, with Mirror Image allowing you to avoid being hit by creating illusory duplicates of yourself. And with the aesthetic of Time Adept that we're going with, you can even say that you're misplacing yourself in time, and thus you're creating alternate copies of yourself in sub-fraction amounts of time, which I think is very aesthetically pleasing. Shift Blame does not have that same kind of aesthetic appeal, but it's really good for getting out of trouble. In some pretty fun and unique roleplay situations, I really like Shift Flame. It's a really fun spell, but overall not super important to the build. I just figured that it was something worth mentioning. Alright, so starting at level 2, we're going to be instantly diving into our Archetype dedication here, which is the Chronoskimmer dedication. It's a really good one. Now, it is a rare dedication, so you might not get access to it, and if that's the case, this build's not going to be applicable because we're using a lot of Chronoskimmer here. Chronoskimmer, in my opinion, is not a OP archetype. It's a strong combat one for sure, but not as bad as Archer. So I would say you shouldn't really have too much problems with this, but depending on your GM, aspects of time and time manipulation might be a hard factor for them. So in any regard, we're using Chronoskimmer a lot. I don't think it's overly powerful, and you can show your GM this build and see if they're okay with what the build is supposed to promise, and hopefully that can get you the clear ahead for this. So anyway, Chronoskimmer, really good. The initial archetype dedication is very interesting. You have 3 choices that you can do. You can either roll initiative normally, you can stabilize your timeline to make your initiative, not roll your initiative, and instead you just add 10 plus whatever your initiative modifier is. So you baseline your initiative modifier, which can be really good if your character has a lot of high wisdom. It can just give you a very high boost right out the bat. But I think the funner one is destabilizing your timeline, because you then make a flat check, a DC 11 flat check. If you succeed, you get 19 plus your initiative modifier, and if you fail, you get a 1 plus your initiative modifier. It doesn't count as a crit failure, so you don't automatically go last, but it's something that's very interesting, and sometimes going later in the combat round is actually beneficial for you anyway. So in any regard, destabilizing gives you a lot more interesting things. Now, it does count as a fortune effect, so if you have anything that affects fortune in your game, just be aware, but this does count as a fortune effect. And as an additional rule, if you ever tie for initiative, you always go first, as your time skipping ability gives you a slight advantage over someone else in this situation. I always have my players default to going first when initiatives are tied, but in any case, if this is ever put into question, Chronoskimmer allows you to automatically be the first one if there's a situation where your initiatives are tied. All right, at level 3, we're going to pick up the general feat of Fleet, which is really good. It gives you an extra actually a flat bonus to your speed, which is very solid. This stacks very well with the bonus we get from Arcane Cascade. And the more maneuverable your character is, the more difficult it is going to be for enemies to get close to your character. So for weaving in and out of combat, it's a really good general feat to pick up and one I highly recommend. At level 4, we're going to be picking up Turn Back the Clock. It's a really good reaction that occurs when you fail a skill check or saving throw. You can do this only once per day, but if you're ever in a bad situation, like a fireball comes up or anything bad where it will put you in a very big disadvantageous position, you can, as a reaction, re-roll the check and get a +1 circumstance bonus as you're applying your future knowledge to the check in the current circumstance. You do have to use the new result no matter what it is, but with the added, obviously you're using this when you fail the check, so probability would state that you have a better chance of rolling higher, as it probably have more results that are higher than what you rolled. So it's really good, and that +1 circumstance bonus as well stacks on top of the chance, so at least you're likely to get a better result, and this can at the very least prevent you from critically failing a check. And since we're playing a much more squishy style of build, giving yourself any kind of breaks when it comes to combat are very, very important. At level 6, we're picking up Expansive Spellstrike. It's an almost necessary feat in the Magus, honestly, because normally when you Spellstrike, you can only Spellstrike using spells that require a spell attack roll. With this, it just needs to be an offensive spell that can target the target, and if it's an area spell, like a fire at least, then you generate the burst area, whatever cone, from a corner of the enemy's square that you hit them with. So if you're using a reach weapon, for instance, you can generate it from that reach square, but if you're in most melee situations, you're essentially just launching that fireball in front of you, which is really good aesthetic. And overall, this is just going to be very solid, especially with this build, because you're going to be weaving in and out of combat in a lot of ways. There's a lot of spells out there that you can utilize that can hamper the enemy, making them less likely or unable to react or retaliate against you in any meaningful way. The fear spell is a really good example of this, as when you hit them with this spell, essentially, they get that frightened condition, which reduces their attacks, their saves, anything until they reduce their fear frightened condition. It can give you a good edge in combat, and it's a really good thing to mix in with your Spellstrike, because you get the benefit of spell striking and debuffing the enemy at the same time. And something I should mention about the build as well, this is a build that I would highly recommend looking to your spell slots. You don't get many, but I would look to your spell slots for spells that are more giving yourself advantages, debuffing the enemy, than it is for straight out damage output. Honestly, spell striking with cantrips is already pretty good, and the extra damage we're going to be getting with the Laughing Shadows addition to damage is going to make the strikes more than worth it, even if we're using a single-handed weapon. So I would definitely use more situations and opportunities to hamper the enemy than to just deal out a butt ton of damage, as especially with this build, you can't be too cautious. You have to be constantly focusing on spacing yourself out from the enemy and making it harder or impossible for them to even reach you. And there's just many good spells that can do that. All right, next up, we're taking Superimpose Time Duplicates. This is a really good feat because what it does is for a single action, you can do this once per hour. You use an action and you automatically make all enemies within your reach flat-footed to you until the end of your turn. It's really, really solid. It's essentially an automatic feint, which is very solid, especially because we're Laughing Shadow, so we get the bonus damage when they are flat-footed. It's very, very important that you utilize this in opportunities where you can really smash the enemy. And because it's a single action, as long as you were adjacent to the enemy when the combat started, or you have a way of getting to them without expending an action, which there are a variety of ways we can do so in this build, this is a very solid way to fish for a crit by flat-footing the enemy and then striking them. There's not many better ways than flat-footing an enemy in general in this game, so this is a feature I really like, and there's no save and nothing. They're just flat-footed to you as you're using alternate timelines of yourself to flank with, which is really, really cool, very, very aesthetic, and it works really well for this build. Also, at level 8, we're going to be picking up the Kip Up skill feat that we should have gotten access to by getting to Master at level 7. Now, Kip Up is really good because what it allows you to do is to stand up from prone without provoking attacks of opportunity. It's not very common in the games, but for a skill feat, this is really good. And since we're playing a already very squishy, or at least a squishier style of character, where we need to get every opportunity to avoid damage as much as possible, and Kip Up is just one of those feats that are going to prevent us from taking damage from a very compromised position by being prone next to an enemy that has an attack of opportunity. All right, at level 10, we're actually taking a feat that some of you might not have expected. We're taking Fused Staff. Now, what Fused Staff does is it allows you to essentially fuse a spellcasting staff into a weapon, and then as an action, you can swap it between your weapon or a spellcasting staff. And this is really good because, one, Maguses have troubles with not having a lot of spell slots. So anything that gives you more spells, like a spell stave, is incredibly helpful. But the other part, and one of the reasons why I selected this one for this build specifically, is it says here in the spell stave, or in the Fused Staff feature, that you can cast spells from the staff as a part of a Spellstrike, even when the staff is in weapon form. Otherwise, you can't cast the spells while it's in its weapon form. There's a lot, like the Staff of Fire has a lot of really good spells in it for spell striking, especially because we have the Expansive Spellstrike, and thus it allows you to get some really good potent spell strikes, and you can use your own spell slots for more of those helpful hampering abilities that I mentioned before that help ensure your survivability more, or can at least make your enemies' lives a living hell. And so this is my solution to the whole spell slot spell strike. You have enough options with the spell strikes from Fused Staff that the enemy doesn't need to, or you don't need to worry about what kind of effects you're going to be throwing at the enemy, and you can use your own spell slots for things that are more utility or things that'll give you advantages in other ways in combat. It's a really good feature, and I highly recommend the Fused Staff, especially because we're going Laughing Shadow, because you can use that extra feature to add damage to your spell strikes that cantrips might not be able to cover. All right, at level 12, we're going to be picking up Dimensional Disappearance, which is an amazing feat because what it does is it enhances our Dimensional Assault feat, or focus spell, that we picked up by being in the Laughing Shadow hybrid study. And Dimensional Assault, if you didn't know, allows you to teleport half your speed up next to a target and then strike. What Dimensional Disappearance does is we're teleporting half our speed, which I should mention as well, that fleet plus the status bonus to movement we're getting for using a one-handed weapon, or being unarmored, sorry, is going to be very important for this part. But when you teleport, you also become invisible, and you do not need to strike the enemy. If you do, of course, the enemy will be flat-footed to you because you're invisible, but you don't have to. And because you're using a conflict spell, and conflict spells, if you don't know, allow you to essentially recharge your spell strike without spending the action to do so. So you're going to run in dimensional strike, or you're going to run in spell strike someone. And then on the next turn, you need to recharge your Spellstrike and maybe get out of trouble. You're going to Dimensional Assault either the same target or another target. You're going to teleport next to them, become invisible. Then you can Stealth as an action. And when you Stealth, you have the opportunity to become undetected to them, meaning that you're no longer hidden to them and they can't find you. So you can't be targeted by their spells or abilities unless they, blindly attack squares, which... this has some metagame stuff that you and the GM might need to work out, but optimally you stealth either away or stay adjacent, but maybe circle around them, and your spell strike is now charged. You're now ready to go, and then you can do a big spell strike hit. You can do a true strike spell strike right to that enemy on the next round, and you're good to go. This is a really good way to bounce in and out of combat, or to bounce between different targets, to get away from a bad situation. Having a high stealth is going to be very important here, because obviously you want to become undetected so they can't target you. And even if you fail for whatever reason, you're still hidden. They still need to make a DC 11 flat check to even hit you. So overall, Dimensional Disappearance is just very solid, and it's something that you can use in a wide variety of ways depending on your knowledge of the spell and the combat situation as a whole. Next up, at level 14, we're going to be picking up Arcane Shroud, which is a really good Magus feat, and essentially what it does is when you go into your Arcane Cascade, you get an additional spell benefit based on the spell you use to meet the prerequisites for Arcane Cascade. Now, if you didn't know, in order to go into Arcane Cascade, you must cast a spell first. So typically, you'll cast a spell, typically a buffing spell, maybe a ranged attack spell, whatever. You'll use this on your first turn, and now you'll get an additional benefit. Some of the Shroud abilities, they're based on the type of spell that you use, and a lot of them are really good. Abjuration gives you Stone Skin, which gives you 5 resistance to all non-magical damage, which is really, really solid. While an illusion spell would give you access to invisibility. Invisibility is our best friend. As we mentioned, kind of in Dimensional Assault, and with our high stealth skill, we can use this to become instantly undetected, pretty much, which is very, very solid. And if it's a transmutation spell, which a lot of the buffing spells are, we get access to Fleet Step, which gives us increased movement and is overall just very solid. So this is a really good way to get extra action economy out of going into your Arcane Cascade, which we do very constantly because we need the extra damage bonus we get when we go into Arcane Cascade to make this build really work. So optimally, you want to get the most out of every action. Arcane Shroud is a really good way to get an additional spell effect along with your Arcane Cascade. All right, at level 16, we're finally dipping back into Chronoskimmer because we're going to be picking up Space-Time Shift. Space-Time Shift is an incredibly good feat. What it allows us to do is once per 10 minutes, so essentially once per combat, really, with how the game tends to work, you can, as a free action, dictate that all your movements for the round is going to be based on teleportation. Sorry, all strides specifically are teleportation until the end of your turn, which is really good because teleportation means that they do not provoke attacks of opportunity, and there's a variety of other things. For instance, you can go through dangerous areas as long as you don't end in the dangerous area without any negative effects, and a wide variety of other things. But the biggest part about this one is it's an amazing disengage tool. And one thing with the build that I've kind of failed to mention up until this point, the real strength of this build is that you can get in, you can attack, spell strike an enemy, and do whatever you need to, and then you can get out. With the high mobility that this build offers, most enemies will need to spend 2 actions to follow you. I mean, if you start off your turn right next to an enemy, you can do a spell strike, do whatever you need to do, and then stride away from the enemy. And because we have, at this point, we should have at least 15 extra feet of movement, that's going to put us at minimum 2 actions away from most enemy types in the game, which 2 action damage mitigation for 1 action is pretty solid. The enemy's more likely to go after one of your allies than they are to pursue after you, which may be good, may be bad, depends on the situation. It's just one of those things that you should really remember, and space-time shift can make this even a factor against enemies that normally have attack of opportunity. This also can help you negate things like difficult terrain or all kinds of stuff. As long as the spaces match your speed, you're free to go wherever you need to go. This is just the perfect feat to allow you to avoid any kind of mobility traps that enemies might have or anything your DM might be setting up. And I think that this is just really, really good. At level 18, we're going to pick up Steal Time. It's a really good feat that allows you to essentially cast slow once per hour without a spell slot. Essentially, it's not even casting a spell, actually. As it reads, select a creature within 30 feet. The creature attempts a fortitude save throw against your Chronoskimmer DC. Chronoskimmer DC is based on your spell DC or your class DC. Because we're a Magus, we're going to be using our spell DC because that should typically be higher than our class DC. Now, the creature takes the effects of the slow based on the result of its saving throw. You are not casting slow. This is not a slow magic effect. This isn't even technically a magical effect. You're affecting their timeline in a way. So something like Counterspell, something like Anti-Magic Zone, whatever, doesn't work on this. This also does not provoke attack of opportunity because you don't need somatic components or anything like that. Literally, you're just slowing an enemy down. And if you're right next to the enemy, this is a good way to make even more distance or make it impossible for them to pursue you. Now, I would have liked to have picked this up a lot sooner in the build, and I will state, a lot of these feats can be taken at will pretty much, as long as you meet the minimum feat requirement. Anything I think past level 8 in this build so far has been taken at levels higher than standard. So there's some mix and matching you can do for the effects that you feel are more necessary for your character in this build. Steal Time's a really good one. I also really like Space-Time Shift, but I don't think you can pick up Space-Time Shift too much sooner. You could get as early as level 12. So depending on how you play, there is a lot of flexibility in this build for the things you want to do. And I made the build very much designed around the ability to get in, deal damage, come out, do whatever you need to do, and you can play in a very specific way, or you can be very flexible depending on your spell choices with your Magus spell list. Now, for level 20, not that it matters too much for most games, I did take the Supreme Spellstrike feat. It gives you an extra strike or the ability to recharge as a free action once per round. Really good, and aesthetically, you could just say that you've mastered time to the point where you've already recharged your Spellstrike in the future, and you're just yoinking it from a future point in time, which I think is a very fun aesthetic and works really well. You can't take it anything less than level 20, so that one's kind of more standard in the build, or at least more like it has to be 20 or nothing. But other than that, these are the feats. I left a lot of flexibility in this build because I feel like Magus is one of the more flexible classes when it comes to your playstyle choices. The Laughing Shadow was a way we could get a lot of very interesting styles of gameplay out of this, but I could see the Inexorable Iron being just as good in this build. And I don't think I've necessarily explained it really well in this. So how this build is more or less supposed to work is you get into your Arcane Cascade. Typically, you're going to buff yourself, cast an illusion spell, what have you, and you're going to be looking for opportunities to strike enemies. You're going to be striking enemies with a backstabbing weapon. In fact, my weapon requirement, or my weapon recommendations is the word I was looking for this build specifically, are most weapons with the backstabber trait. In fact, I picked the War Razor specifically because it's a weapon that has backstabber, and if you didn't know what backstabber does, is when an enemy is flat-footed, you deal an additional damage, and this increases to 2 if you have a +3 weapon. This 1 damage stacks on top of the flat-footed attack bonus we get from Arcane Cascade for being Laughing Shadow, which is very solid. And this weapon has a deadly D8, which means that you add an additional D8 damage when you strike an enemy with a critical blow. And this is also a finesse weapon. It's also agile, but Magus don't really typically concern themselves with agile weapons, because their action economy is so filled up with Spellstrike or whatever you're trying to do in the round. You don't often attack more than once. Agile can come in handy for this build, but it's not going to be very helpful. Finesse allows us to roll our dex rather than our strength when it comes to striking a foe, which is very strong and very, very good, because obviously we're using dex as our highest stat in this build to get the most out of our AC that we can. And with acrobatics and stealth, obviously this is a really good weapon, though it is only a D4, and some people might look at that and kind of stick their nose up at it. But it's a D4 that when you're starting the game out, it's a D4 that's going to get an additional 4 damage on top of your strength modifier right out the gate. So even a D6 or a D8 weapon would struggle to match your damage consistency as long as you're hitting enemies who are flat-footed. And because your main target are flat-footed enemies, you also have a higher chance of critting, and with that higher chance of critting, the deadly D8 is even more damage we're adding on top of it. So honestly, the War Razor is a really, really good weapon for this build, and your focus on taking enemies that maybe are weaker, teleporting to them with dimensional assaults, or doing a bunch of burst damage. You can even tango with much bigger enemies because you have so much movement and so much ability to get away in this build, with the slow that you can get and with various spells and abilities that you can add. Haste is your best friend in this build. Obviously, getting that extra movement can really make a lot of what you're doing in this build work very well. This build just offers a lot, and depending on how you play, there's a lot of different combinations of spells you can do to get some really interesting effects. And I felt like the most interesting way to play the Time Adept was to not focus on health, to motivate you to fight in a way that's very hit and run, in and out, do damage, get out of there. If that's not your style, then obviously you could go with something more like an Inexorable Iron, wear medium armor, and just use a lot of the Chronoskimmer abilities that allow you to kind of dictate how the fight goes by going first in combat. Obviously, using duplicate disposition ability that allows you to flank with yourself, essentially, which is also really, really good. This build is really solid, and the best part about it is with the abilities you get from Chronoskimmer, you don't need a lot of the skill feats a lot of martials tend to use. Things like Feint or Intimidate or all those kind of feats in general, you don't need, because you can just use other abilities to kind of get the same flat-footed effect that you can on other enemies. It's very, very solid. It can be very self-sufficient, or it can be very utility-based. Now, I already mentioned one of the equipment that I'm recommending for this, which is going to be the War Razor, but I'm also going to recommend some magic items, which I don't typically do, but for this build in particularly, it works really well. I'm going to recommend picking up the Cloak and Boots of Elven Kind for a variety of reasons, but they do stack incredibly well, almost too well with this build. Boots of Elven Kind not only give you a status bonus to your acrobatics, which, hey, acrobatics was one of the skills that we are focusing on in this build anyway, which is really, really good. But at a frequency of once per hour, you can ignore difficult terrain when moving on the ground. If you're wearing the Cloak, you will get a +5 status bonus to your movement speed, but if you're in Arcane Cascade, that clashes, so you wouldn't get that bonus. So that's not a really big thing. That's not a super big deal in general. Honestly, just being able to ignore difficult terrain is huge. And like I mentioned with this build before, being able to ignore things like difficult terrain or terrain of any kind is very solid, just because your character can't be caught in a situation where they can't get away. So this is very, very important. Now, the Cloak of Elven Kind is a little bit more important for this build, because it gives you a +1 item bonus to your stealth checks, which are really, really, really huge. But you can also cast once per day or twice per day if you have the boots, invisibility on yourself, which is very, very solid. And if you get the higher levels of these versions, I believe you get the greater effects for stealth and such. Yes, you get the 4th level invisibility, and you get a +2 item bonus to stealth. And I believe for the boots, it's +2 for acrobatics, and you can cast Pass Without a Trace, which not a big spell, but you know, in any regard, a really good item set for this build. It just fits so perfectly, and it allows you to be stealthier, allows you to avoid bad situations more easily. Just something I would really highly recommend for this build. Now, as I typically do, I do recommend some archetypes that you, if you were to take with the bonus archetype rule, would fit with this particular build in general, which I do recommend all tables use the bonus archetype rule because it is very, very good. And especially with the way we do it, I don't allow multi-class archetyping with the archetype free bonus feats. So it does force you to kind of focus more on the alternative choices, which I think makes the characters more dynamic. But no matter how you play, I do recommend you take it anyway because it just makes your character more diverse. And the power gain is not that big. Your character gets more things they can do, but they don't necessarily get better at some of those things. Though there are some exceptions, of course. In any regard, my recommendations, one, over here, Chronoskimmer. Actually, take Chronoskimmer as your bonus archetype. There's so many of the Chronoskimmer feats I really wanted to take with this build, but I didn't because I didn't want to just not take any Magus feats. And honestly, the Magus feats I took, I think were very necessary for the build anyway. So if you took Chronoskimmer in those slots instead, I think the build would do a lot better in a lot of ways. And you can use other archetypes in the build a little bit more supplemented. In fact, I'd recommend that if you were doing the bonus archetype feat and you were taking Chronoskimmer in your bonus slots, that you take any spellcasting multiclass, actually, because one of the big problems with Magus is they just don't get a lot of spell slots. So going into a multiclass for any of the spellcasting, probably using something like Arcane or Divine, buffing, or however your style is in any regard, it would be really good to get more spell slots. If anything, more level 1 spell slots for True Strike is just really good because True Strike just makes Magus blow up. Being able to roll with advantage on an attack is just nuts. And it's really good for a crit fishing build, and this build is very benefits from crit fishing specifically. So yeah, adding more spell slots is really good. Any way you can do that, multi-class archetype is the way I would go. And another archetype I'd recommend taking along with this one as well is Acrobat. Actually, one, just the initial dedication fee allowing you to get to legendary and acrobatics without any of your skill increases is just very, very solid. But also something like Tumbling Strike or Tumbling Opportunist just work really well with this build because there are other ways to make the enemy flat-footed to your strikes and ways to tumble through enemy squares without provoking attack of opportunity can be really good in some situations. And as I mentioned before, because this is a lot more of a do or die style of build, we want to avoid situations where we're getting cornered by big bad enemies. So this is definitely one of the ones I would recommend picking up with the build as well. And as far as ancestries are concerned with this one, I actually have some very interesting ones for you here today. Now, my number one pick here is going to be Android. I think Android just really fits the aesthetic of the build in general. Also, the Nanite Surge abilities just can enhance your capabilities even further, really give your character small bursts of power. Even a Protective Protocol, I think it's what it's called, or whatever it is, allows you to get a bonus on a saving throw that you're about to take. Android offers a lot, but it's another rare one, so obviously, you might be pushing the envelope a little bit with that one. I do like the Android aesthetic, though. I think Android is very solid for narrative reasons. It gives you a level of mysticism because it's like, oh, I have access to temporal abilities because of space, whatever, however you want to make your character backstory lean. I think that there's something interesting there. The more surprising ancestry that fits with this build a little too well, and I think I'm very happy with how it turned out, is Kobold, actually. Kobold is a very fun ancestry, and what it allows you to do is things like Cringe, which can mitigate some of the damage from a critical strike against you. They have a lot of ways to move without being struck, getting out of bad situations, but more than anything, With Kobold weapon familiarity, you can get an advanced weapon and treat it as a martial weapon, and this weapon, in this case, is the Tricky Pick, which is a 1d6 modular weapon, which means you can swap the pick head to do any kind of damage type I believe it's one action to swap the head to piercing, bludgeoning, or whatever. But not only that, it's a backstabber weapon with fatal d10, so an upgrade to deadly. Fatal, what it does is when you crit, you up the damage of the weapon to the fatal die type and add an additional die type after the critical is done, or an additional die of that type after the damage is done. And the Tricky Pick is already a d6, so fatal d10, very, very solid. It's not a finesse weapon, so that's very important. You cannot select this, or you need to know that if you're selecting this, your strength might need to be a little bit higher to get the most out of it, but I think it's worth it because the Tricky Pick is a very strong weapon, and it's only one-handed as well, which is incredibly good. Backstabber, fatal d10, it's just an upgrade to the War Razor in almost every way, except it's not a finesse weapon, which is its only downside, but I think a 1 or 2 point difference to your attack is not a big deal when you get all these extra benefits with the Tricky Pick as well. So Kobold works with this build surprisingly really, really well, and I think that's absolutely fabulous. And that is the end for this build. I hope you all liked it. I hope it wasn't too rambly. It's really hard to talk about the dynamics of a Magus in a build video like this, because Magus is not as simple as it might look at. It's not a class that just comes up and just spellstrike, spellstrike, spellstrike. While that is the highest way to do the most damage, that's not necessarily the best way to get the most out of the class. And this style of build really emphasizes that, because it allows you to play in a very dynamic and diverse way that you normally wouldn't get with that style of gameplay. And a very unique way that you can't get with a lot of the classes in the game either. I think it's a very fun class. The aesthetics and such that we set into this build are very good. And overall, I think the Time Adept is just a very solid build overall. But tell me what you think down below in the comments. And that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.